For 7 years, I mourned my sister Emma, believing she had died in a car accident. But a slip-up from my parents unraveled everything. It turns out Emma wasn't dead. She was alive, locked away in prison. What could drive my family to lie about something so huge? And when I discovered the truth, the betrayal was only the beginning. 7 years ago, when I was 14, my life changed forever. My parents sat me down in the living room, their faces pale and strained, and delivered the news no teenager ever wants to hear. My older sister, Emma, was gone. They said she'd been in a car accident, killed instantly when a truck ran a red light and slammed into her car. The words didn't make sense at first. Emma, with her infectious laugh and endless energy, couldn't just be gone. But the look in my parents' eyes was unmistakable, anguish mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Numbness washed over me as I tried to comprehend the enormity of what they were saying. There was no traditional funeral, which struck me as odd even at 14. My parents said they didn't want a big public service and opted for a small memorial at home instead. We decorated the living room with her favorite flowers and framed pictures, lit candles, and shared quiet stories about her life. At the time, I didn't question it. I trusted my parents, and if they said this was what Emma would have wanted, I believed them. The loss of Emma left a void in my life that nothing could fill. She wasn't just my sister. She was my confidant, the person who always knew how to make me laugh, even on my worst days. She'd take me to the movies when I was feeling down, sneak me snacks when my parents said no, and tell me secrets about life and love that made me feel like I was in on the world's best-kept mysteries. After she was gone, everything felt quieter, heavier. I'd sit in her room sometimes, surrounded by her books and clothes, trying to feel close to her again. I'd replay old memories in my mind, the way she'd roll her eyes but smile when I borrowed her makeup, the inside jokes we'd whisper at family dinners. But as much as I tried to hold on to her, doubts began to creep in. Small things about the story my parents had told me didn't add up. They avoided talking about the accident in detail, brushing off my questions with vague responses. I didn't even know where it had happened, just somewhere out of town. At the time, I chalked it up to their grief. But deep down, something felt off. As the years passed, the cracks in their story grew harder to ignore. For starters, there were no police reports or articles about the accident. I searched online one day when I was 16, desperate to find some kind of record, but there was nothing. When I asked my mom about it, she sighed and said it was a small-town accident. Not everything makes the news. That explanation satisfied me for a while, but other inconsistencies nagged at me. Why had we never visited Emma's grave? My parents said they'd had her cremated and scattered her ashes at her favorite park, but they refused to take me there, saying it was too painful for them. Looking back, there were moments when my parents seemed almost relieved, like they had dodged some terrible burden. It was subtle, an odd smile here, a quick change of subject there. At the time, I thought it was their way of coping. Now, I realize it was something much darker. By the time I was in my early 20s, Emma's absence was an ache I had learned to live with, but the doubts never fully left me. I tried to shake them off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. After all, my parents had no reason to lie to me. But there's something about grief that sharpens your instincts, makes you hyper-aware of the things people don't say. And the things my parents didn't say about Emma, how she died, why we never talked about her last months, started to gnaw at me. I didn't know it then, but the truth about Emma wasn't buried in some faraway grave. It was much closer than I ever could have imagined, hidden beneath years of lies and silence. When I was 17, 3 years after Emma's supposed death, I came across something that didn't sit right. It started with an afternoon of cleaning out the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with boxes of old books, clothes, and family memorabilia. While rummaging through a stack of photo albums, I stumbled upon one labeled Emma's Memories. Curious, I opened it, flipping through the pages of her life. There were pictures of her as a child, her awkward middle school years, and finally, her high school days. One photo caught my eye. Emma at her high school graduation, beaming with pride, her cap tilted slightly to the side. I couldn't help but smile, remembering how she'd teased me about how I'd look in my graduation robe someday. But as I turned the pages, something felt incomplete. The photos suddenly stopped, leaving a stark gap where the final year of her life should have been. There were no pictures of her at holidays, no snapshots of her friends, no candid moments from her day-to-day life. It was as if her existence had abruptly been erased. Later that evening, I showed the album to my mom while she was folding laundry in the living room. "Why don't we have more pictures of Emma's last year?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. My mom froze, her hands gripping the edge of a towel. For a moment, her face was unreadable, but then she gave me a strained smile. We lost so much in the accident, remember? A lot of her things were damaged or misplaced. Her words sounded reasonable enough, but something about the way she said it felt off. Her voice had a rehearsed quality, as though she'd practiced the explanation in case I ever asked. I didn't push her. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of years spent grieving. But her reaction planted a seed of doubt in my mind that wouldn't go away. Over the next few years, I started noticing more inconsistencies. Anytime I mentioned Emma, my parents would change the subject or brush off my questions. Once, when I brought up the accident and asked for more details, my dad grew visibly tense. "We've already told you everything, haven't we? Why dig up old wounds?" he said, his tone unusually sharp. It wasn't just their evasiveness that bothered me. It was the way they acted whenever Emma's name came up in casual conversation. My mom would get fidgety, her eyes darting toward my dad as if seeking his approval before responding. My dad, on the other hand, would go quiet, his jaw tightening in a way that made it clear he didn't want to talk about her at all. I started paying closer attention, picking up on the little tells that hinted at a bigger story beneath the surface. They never mentioned the specifics of the accident, where it had happened, what road she'd been on, or even what time of night it occurred. The details were always vague, as though they were afraid of saying too much. The more I thought about it, the more questions began to pile up in my mind. Why had we never visited Emma's grave? Why were there no obituaries or news articles about the accident? And why did my parents get so defensive every time I tried to ask about it? I started to wonder if I'd been too young and grief-stricken to notice these inconsistencies when Emma died. At 14, I hadn't thought to ask the hard questions, and my parents' grief seemed so real that I never doubted them. But now, as an older teenager, I couldn't help but feel like there were pieces missing from the story they'd told me. By the time I turned 18, those doubts had turned into a quiet determination to uncover the truth. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew one thing for sure. My parents weren't telling me everything. And whatever they were hiding, it was something they didn't want me to find out. Little did I know, the answers I was searching for were far darker and more complicated than I could have imagined. The moment that changed everything came when I was 21. I'd just graduated college and decided to spend the weekend at my parents' house to celebrate. It felt good to be back, sitting at the dinner table where so many of my childhood memories had been made. For once, things felt normal, until my dad made an offhand remark that cracked the facade wide open. We were halfway through dinner, talking about mundane things like work and the neighbors, when my dad, out of nowhere, said Emma was dealing with so much back then. It's no wonder she... He trailed off, his face tightening as if he'd realized too late what he was about to say. My fork clattered against my plate. "What do you mean? What was she dealing with?" The room went silent. My mom shot my dad a sharp, warning look, her lips pressing into a thin line. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on his glass of water. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just, the usual stuff. Being a teenager can be tough." He laughed awkwardly, but the tension in the room was palpable. That answer didn't sit right with me. I could tell there was more he wasn't saying, and for the rest of dinner, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. Emma was dealing with so much back then. What troubles had she been facing? Why had my parents never mentioned this before? After we finished eating, I decided to confront my dad. I found him in the living room, pretending to be engrossed in a baseball game on TV. "Dad," I said, standing in the doorway, "what did you mean at dinner? About Emma having troubles?" He didn't look at me. "I told you, it was nothing," he said, his voice low and guarded. "It didn't sound like nothing," I pressed. "What was going on with her?" He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I don't want to talk about it, okay? It's in the past. Let it go." But I couldn't. His words had ignited something inside me, a need to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as questions swirled in my mind. What had Emma been dealing with before she died? Was she struggling with something my parents had kept from me? A bad relationship? Depression? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. My parents had always painted Emma as practically perfect, smart, outgoing, and full of life. But what if that image wasn't the whole truth? And then there was the way my mom had reacted at dinner, the way she'd shut my dad down with a single look. It wasn't the first time I'd seen her act like that when Emma's name came up. It was as though Emma's memory was something fragile, something they had to guard carefully.
But why?
Unable to sleep, I got up and started going through old photo albums again, searching for anything I might have missed. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed little things that seemed off. Photos where Emma looked unusually serious, captions that felt strangely vague. I even found a few pictures where she was with people I didn't recognize, friends my parents had never mentioned. It was clear that there was more to Emma's story than I'd been told, and I was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, I tried bringing it up with my mom, hoping she might give me a clearer answer. "Mom, can we talk about what Dad said last night? About Emma having troubles?" She didn't look up from her coffee. "There's nothing to talk about," she said flatly.
But
"Let it go," she said, cutting me off. Her tone was firm, almost cold, and it was clear she wasn't going to budge. Her refusal only made me more suspicious. My parents had always been open with me about everything, except when it came to Emma. The way they dodged questions, changed the subject, and avoided details made it obvious that they were hiding something. For years, I'd accepted the story they'd given me about Emma's death. But now, for the first time, I felt like I couldn't trust them. And that realization shook me to my core. I didn't know what they were hiding, but I was determined to find out. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about Emma was far more complicated and far more disturbing than I'd ever imagined. My dad's slip-up about Emma's troubles gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't ignore. If they weren't going to tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. Armed with determination and the nagging suspicion that there was far more to the story, I decided to dig through anything that might shed light on Emma's final months. The attic seemed like the best place to start. It was a maze of dusty boxes, filled with everything from old holiday decorations to long-forgotten photo albums. It wasn't organized, but it held the remnants of our family history. Somewhere among the clutter, I hoped to find answers. I spent hours combing through the chaos, opening box after box of seemingly useless keepsakes. Then I found it, a small plastic bin labeled Emma's Things. My heart pounded as I pulled it out and removed the lid. Inside were a few books, some jewelry, and a stack of notebooks. One of the notebooks immediately caught my eye. It was a plain, spiral-bound journal with Emma's journal scrawled across the front in her neat handwriting. I hesitated for a moment, feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal, but my curiosity won out. Most of the entries were what I'd expected: musings about school, notes about her friends, even random lists of things she wanted to do that summer. But as I flipped through the pages, one entry stopped me cold. The date caught my attention first. It was written only a month before Emma's supposed death. The tone of the entry was a stark contrast to the others. Her usually lighthearted voice had been replaced with something darker, more fearful. "I feel like I'm in over my head. Things are spiraling out of control, and I don't know who I can trust anymore. Jake says he has a plan, but I don't know if I believe him. If this goes wrong, I don't even want to think about what could happen." I reread the entry several times, the words, spiraling out of control, echoing in my mind. Who was Jake? And what kind of plan was she talking about? My parents had never mentioned anything about her being in trouble or knowing someone named Jake. The discovery sent my thoughts racing. My parents had painted Emma as the perfect daughter, someone who had her life together. But this journal entry hinted at a very different story. It sounded like she was involved in something serious, maybe even dangerous. I scoured the rest of the journal for more clues, flipping through page after page, but there were no other mentions of Jake. The rest of the entries returned to mundane topics, as though Emma had deliberately avoided writing anything else about whatever she'd gotten herself into. Frustrated but determined, I turned to the other items in the box. Most of it was unremarkable: old birthday cards, a few pieces of costume jewelry, but tucked at the bottom, I found a small stack of photographs. The pictures showed Emma with a group of friends I didn't recognize. They were taken at what looked like a park or outdoor hangout spot. Emma was laughing in most of them, her arm draped around a guy with dark hair and a mischievous smile. On the back of one photo, in Emma's handwriting, was a single word: Jake. Seeing his face made the situation feel more real and more troubling. Who was this guy, and what kind of trouble had he pulled Emma into? My parents had never mentioned a Jake, and yet here he was, smiling alongside my sister in a photo taken shortly before her death. The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. Why had my parents erased this part of Emma's life? What kind of trouble had she been in? And why did they feel the need to lie about it for so many years? I decided to confront them again, this time armed with the journal and the photo. But deep down, I already knew they wouldn't give me the answers I needed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they were forming wasn't one I was ready for. Something about this whole situation felt bigger than just my family's grief. It felt like a secret that someone had worked very hard to keep buried. And I was determined to unearth it, no matter what it cost. The journal entry haunted me. The mention of serious trouble and the mysterious Jake felt like a thread connecting all the inconsistencies I'd noticed over the years. Determined to get answers, I confronted my parents one evening after dinner. I walked into the living room, clutching the journal in one hand and the photo of Emma with Jake in the other. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "We need to talk." They looked up from the TV, my dad frowning, and my mom already looking uneasy. I held up the journal, flipping to the entry that had consumed my thoughts. "What is this?" I demanded, reading the words aloud. She wrote this a month before she died. What trouble was she talking about? Who is Jake? My mom's face went pale, her hands clutching the edge of the couch cushion. My dad avoided my gaze, his jaw tightening as if he were bracing himself for a storm. "What aren't you telling me?" I pressed, my voice rising. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. Then my dad sighed heavily and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You deserve to know the truth," he said, his voice low. "But it's not what you think." "What truth?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. He hesitated, glancing at my mom, who shook her head as if begging him not to continue. But he ignored her, turning back to me with a weary expression. "Emma isn't dead," he said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, struggling to process what I'd just heard. "What are you talking about?" asked, my voice trembling. "She's alive," my mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's in prison." I stared at them, my mind racing. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. For 7 years, I had believed my sister was gone. I'd mourned her, cried for her, carried the weight of her absence in my heart. And now they were telling me she was alive, locked away somewhere? Why? I demanded, my voice rising with anger and confusion. "Why would you lie to me about this? Why would you let me believe she was dead?" My mom sobbed into her hands, unable to answer, but my dad spoke up, his voice tight. "We thought we were protecting you," he said. "You were just a kid, and what Emma did, it wasn't something we wanted you to carry." "What did she do?" I asked, my stomach twisting in knots. My dad hesitated, then said, "She was arrested for armed robbery. She got caught up with the wrong people, and it spiraled out of control." "Jake," I said, the name feeling bitter on my tongue. He nodded grimly. "He was the one who dragged her into it. They committed a series of robberies together, but when they were caught, Emma refused to give him up. She took the fall for everything." I felt sick. The image of my sister, the bright, confident, loving person I had idolized, shattered into pieces. How could she have done something like this? And why had my parents decided to bury the truth instead of telling me? "We couldn't face it," my mom said, her voice muffled through her tears. "We couldn't face what people would say, what it would do to you. So we made a decision to tell you she was gone." Their words left me reeling. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the fact that my sister had been alive this whole time, or the fact that my parents had lied to me about it for years. I stormed out of the room, needing space to process everything. My emotions swung wildly between anger, sadness, and confusion. How could they justify keeping this from me? Did they not trust me enough to handle the truth? But beneath the anger, a new feeling began to take root: determination. If Emma was alive, I needed to see her. I needed to hear her side of the story. Whatever she had done, whatever mistakes she had made, she was still my sister. And I wasn't going to let another day go by without finding her. After the shock of my parents' revelation, I demanded answers, real answers. No more lies, no more half-truths. I sat them down in the living room, my heart pounding, and told them I wasn't leaving until they explained everything. They exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations that only comes from years of being together. My mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling, while my dad leaned back in his chair, his face lined with exhaustion. "All right," he said finally, his voice heavy. "We owe you the truth." The story they told me was almost too surreal to believe. Emma had fallen in with the wrong crowd during her final year of high school. My parents said it started with small things. She'd hang out with people they didn't approve of, stay out late, and come home with excuses that didn't quite add up. But it wasn't until she met Jake that things took a darker turn. Jake was trouble from the start, my dad said, his voice bitter. We warned her, but she wouldn't listen. She thought she was in love. Jake, they explained, had a criminal history, though Emma either didn't know or didn't care. He introduced her to a lifestyle that was reckless and dangerous. According to my parents, Emma began lying more often, skipping family events, and growing distant. Then came the breaking point, a string of armed robberies that landed Emma and Jake in serious trouble. They targeted small businesses, places with minimal security, and made off with cash and valuables. The police caught up with them after their third robbery, arresting Emma and several others. She wouldn't talk, my dad said, shaking his head. When they questioned her, she refused to name anyone else involved. She protected Jake and the others, taking the full blame for everything. The weight of their words settled on me like a stone. My sister, the same Emma who used to lecture me about being responsible and making good choices, had been caught committing armed robbery. And instead of fighting to clear her name, she had chosen to protect the very people who had led her down that path. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, my dad continued. We visited her a few times in the beginning, but it was hard. Too hard. And then she begged us to stop. Why would she ask you to stop visiting? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. She didn't want us to see her like that, my mom said, her voice breaking. She was ashamed of what she'd done. And she didn't want you to know. My mom wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath before continuing. When we told her how devastated you were, she made us promise to tell you she was gone. She thought it would be easier for you to grieve than to know the truth. She didn't want you to think badly of her. Their words cut deeper than I thought possible. I felt a strange mix of anger and heartbreak. Anger at my parents for making that decision for me, and heartbreak for Emma, who had been carrying so much guilt and shame alone. Do you have any idea what it was like for me? I asked, my voice rising. I spent 7 years mourning her. 7 years thinking she was dead. And you let me believe that because it was easier for you? My mom started sobbing again, while my dad just stared at the floor. We didn't know what else to do, he said quietly. We thought we were protecting you. I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing with questions. Where is she now? Do you even know? She's still serving her sentence, my dad said. She's at a women's prison a couple of hours from here. I couldn't believe it. Emma was so close, and yet for 7 years, I'd been made to believe she was gone forever. I need to see her, I said firmly. My mom looked up, her face pale. Are you sure? She might not want to see you. I don't care, I said, my voice steady. I need to hear it from her. I need to know why she let this happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to everything my parents had told me. I thought about the sister I had idolized, the perfect image of her I'd built up in my mind over the years. That image had been shattered, replaced by a woman I barely recognized, a woman who had made mistakes, who had suffered, and who had been erased from my life by the people I trusted most. But even through my anger and confusion, one thing remained clear. Emma was still my sister, and I wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The next morning, I told my parents I was going to visit her. They didn't try to stop me. Instead, they gave me the address of the prison and wished me luck, their voices heavy with regret. I didn't know what I would say to Emma when I saw her, or how I would even begin to process the mess our family had become. But I knew one thing for sure. I needed to see her. I needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I knew I couldn't let things end with my parents' confession. Emma wasn't some distant memory anymore. She was alive, and I needed to see her. I needed answers, not secondhand stories filtered through years of guilt and shame. With my parents' help, I tracked her down to a women's correctional facility a few hours away. My mom gave me the address reluctantly, her hands trembling as she slid the slip of paper across the table. She might not want to see you, she said quietly. She's not the same girl you remember. I have to try, I replied. The drive to the prison felt endless, my thoughts racing the entire time. I kept imagining Emma as she'd been the last time I'd seen her, bright, confident, full of life. But my parents' words about how she'd changed lingered in my mind, filling me with equal parts hope and dread. When I finally arrived, the cold, sterile atmosphere of the facility hit me like a wall. The guards at the front desk were matter-of-fact, barely looking at me as I signed in and handed over my ID. They gave me a visitor's badge and directed me to a small waiting area with hard plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. After what felt like an eternity, a door on the far side of the room opened, and a guard led Emma in. My breath caught in my throat as I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I barely recognized her. She looked older, her face sharper and lined with exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and the orange prison jumpsuit hung loosely on her thin frame. But when her eyes met mine, something softened in her expression. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. I couldn't hold back my tears. "Emma," I whispered, my voice breaking. She hesitated for a moment, then took the seat across from me, her hands cuffed in front of her. Seeing her like that, restrained, confined, broke something inside me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, wiping at my face as the tears kept falling. Emma looked down, her shoulders slumping. "Because I didn't want to ruin your life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were just a kid. I didn't want you to be ashamed of me." "How could I be ashamed of you?" I said, my voice trembling. "You were my sister. You are my sister. I thought you were dead, Emma. I've been mourning you for 7 years." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "I thought it would be easier for you," she said. "Easier than knowing your sister was a criminal. You don't get to make that choice for me," I said, my anger and heartbreak spilling out. "I deserved to know the truth. I deserved the chance to help you, to at least be there for you." Emma shook her head. "There was nothing you could have done," she said. "I made my choices. I got myself into this mess, and I didn't want you dragged down with me." As much as her words hurt, I could see the pain behind them. Emma wasn't just carrying the weight of her own mistakes. She was carrying the burden of what those mistakes had done to me, to our family. Over the next hour, she told me everything. About Jake, about the robberies, about how she'd been too scared and too in love to see the danger she was in until it was too late. "By the time I realized what he was really like, I was already in too deep," she said. "And when we got caught, I thought if I took the blame, it would at least protect him." "Why would you protect someone like that?" I asked, struggling to keep the anger out of my voice. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I thought he'd change. Or maybe I was just too scared to face the truth about who he was, and who I'd become." By the time our visit ended, I felt emotionally drained. Seeing Emma again was a mix of relief, sadness, and anger I couldn't quite process. She wasn't the sister I remembered, but she was still Emma. As the guard led her away, she turned back to look at me one last time. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "For everything." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said and what she hadn't. Emma had made mistakes, yes, but she'd also been failed by the people who were supposed to protect her, just like I'd been failed by the lies my parents had told. But now that I knew the truth, I was determined to find a way forward for both of us. Emma wasn't just my past, she was still my sister, and I wasn't going to give up on her. The first visit with Emma left me emotionally raw, but it also reignited something I thought I'd lost: hope. Despite everything, she was still my sister, and I wasn't ready to let go of her again. Over the next few months, I made it a priority to visit her as often as I could, slowly piecing together the connection we'd lost. Each visit brought new layers to her story. At first, Emma was hesitant to open up, her words guarded and cautious. But over time, she began to trust me, sharing the mistakes that had led her here and the deep regrets that haunted her every day. "I was so stupid," she said one afternoon, her voice filled with bitterness. "I thought I could handle it all, Jake, the robberies, the lies. But every decision I made just pushed me further into a hole I couldn't climb out of." She told me about Jake in detail, the way he'd seemed charming and confident at first, promising her a life of excitement and adventure. But beneath the charm, he was manipulative and controlling, slowly isolating her from her friends and family. "I wanted to believe in him," Emma admitted. "He made me feel like I was special, like I could have this amazing life with him. But it was all a lie. By the time I realized what he really was, it was too late." Hearing her talk about Jake filled me with anger, not just at him, but at the system that had allowed someone like him to walk free while Emma took the fall. She told me how the other people involved in the robberies had either fled or cut deals with the police, leaving her to bear the full weight of their crimes. "I thought I was doing the right thing by protecting them," she said, her voice breaking. "But all it did was destroy my life." Through these conversations, I saw a side of Emma I hadn't expected, a woman who had been broken but was determined to rebuild herself, piece by piece. She wasn't looking for pity or forgiveness, only a chance to make amends and move forward. One afternoon, during a particularly emotional visit, she said something that stuck with me. I thought I was protecting you, she said, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I thought if you didn't know, you could have a normal life. But I realize now that shutting you out hurt us both. I missed you so much, and I hated myself for what I'd done to you. Her words broke me. For so long, I'd felt like the victim of her choices, but hearing her remorse helped me see things differently. She had been trying to protect me in the only way she knew how, even if her decision had caused us both pain. Forgiving Emma wasn't easy, but it was easier than forgiving my parents. Every time I thought about the years I'd spent mourning her, the birthdays and holidays where her absence had felt like a knife in my chest, I felt a surge of anger toward them. They should have told me. I vented to a friend one evening. They had no right to make that decision for me. My friend nodded sympathetically, but said something that made me pause. Maybe they didn't know how to handle it, she suggested. Parents aren't perfect, and grief makes people do crazy things. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. My parents had made a terrible mistake, but they had done it out of fear and love. A twisted kind of love, but love nonetheless. As the months went on, I began to rebuild my relationship with them as well. It wasn't easy. The resentment I felt didn't disappear overnight. But as we had more honest conversations about Emma and the choices they'd made, I started to see their humanity. We thought we were doing what was best for you, my mom said during one of our talks. But looking back, I realized we were just scared. We didn't want to lose you, too. Their words didn't erase the pain, but they softened it. Slowly, we began to heal as a family, finding a way to move forward together. And through it all, my bond with Emma grew stronger. Each visit was a reminder of the sister I'd lost and found again, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. She wasn't perfect, but neither was I. What mattered was that we had each other, and we weren't going to let anything tear us apart again. Confronting my parents about the years of deception was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Even after months of visits with Emma and countless conversations about the truth, there was still a lingering tension between us. Their choice to lie about Emma's death wasn't something I could easily forgive, and every time I thought about the lost years, it reopened old wounds. When I finally sat them down for an honest conversation, I didn't hold back. Do you have any idea what it was like for me? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. I grieved for her. I cried for her. And all that time, you knew she was alive and you said nothing. How could you do that to me? My mom started to cry, her face crumpling as she tried to respond. We thought we were protecting you, she said. You were just a kid. We didn't want you to carry the shame or see her like that. At first, their defensiveness frustrated me. They repeated the same justifications I'd heard before, how they'd wanted to shield me, how they thought it was better if I didn't know. But as the conversation went on, their walls began to crack, and for the first time, I saw how much pain they'd been carrying, too. We were ashamed, my mom admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know how to handle it. Your dad and we made a terrible decision, and we thought it would be easier for everyone if we pretended it didn't happen. Easier for who? I asked, my voice sharp. Because it wasn't easier for me. And it definitely wasn't easier for Emma. My dad, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. You're right, he said, his voice heavy. We were wrong. We should have told you the truth. But at the time, we didn't know what else to do. We were scared of losing you. 2. Hearing him acknowledge their mistake didn't erase the hurt, but it was a start. For the first time, they weren't just defending their actions, they were taking responsibility for the damage they had caused. The road to healing wasn't easy. Forgiving them felt like an uphill battle, and there were days when the anger resurfaced, raw and biting. But little by little, we began to mend the fractures in our relationship. One day, during a quiet moment in the kitchen, my mom said something that struck a chord. We spent so much time trying to protect you from the truth, she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. But I realize now that secrets only make things worse. They don't protect anyone. They just hurt the people you love. Her words lingered with me, and I realized that she was right. The lie they told about Emma hadn't just hurt me, it had hurt our entire family. It had driven a wedge between us, creating years of distance that could have been avoided if they'd had the courage to be honest. Over time, we found ways to rebuild trust. My parents started being more open about their emotions, sharing the guilt and regret they'd buried for so long. They even began to talk about Emma more freely, reminiscing about the good times and acknowledging the mistakes they'd made in handling her situation. We also worked together to support Emma during her remaining time in prison. My parents started visiting her again, slowly rebuilding their own relationship with her. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness and unspoken tension, but it was progress. For me, the most important part of the healing process was setting boundaries. I made it clear that I couldn't forget what had happened, but I was willing to forgive if they continued to be honest with me moving forward. No more secrets, I told them firmly. If we're going to be a family, we have to be honest with each other, even when it's hard. They agreed, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same page. Looking back, I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it. My parents' decision to lie about Emma had caused immeasurable pain, but it had also taught us the value of truth, even when it's uncomfortable or messy. As a family, we made a pact to build a future that was rooted in honesty and trust. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Slowly, the wounds began to close, and we found a way to move forward together. Through it all, I held on to one simple truth. Families are complicated, imperfect, and messy, but they're also resilient. And even after years of secrets and mistakes, it's never too late to start over. Today, my sister Emma is out of prison, and the person she's become fills me with pride. Rebuilding our relationship wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and tears, but every step was worth it. The bond we lost for 7 years is slowly being repaired, and now, it feels stronger than ever. Emma has dedicated herself to turning her life around. She started by taking small steps, like getting a part-time job and enrolling in classes to finish her degree. Watching her rebuild her life piece by piece has been inspiring. She doesn't shy away from the mistakes she made, but instead, she uses them as fuel to move forward. I want to prove to myself, and to you, that I'm more than my past, she told me during one of our many long talks. And she's doing just that. Her resilience, determination, and willingness to confront her demons remind me every day that people are capable of incredible growth. As for my parents, their lie is something that will always linger in the back of my mind. It's a painful memory that can't be erased, no matter how much time passes. But I've chosen to forgive them, even if I can't entirely forget. Their fear and shame drove their actions, and while I wish they had made a different choice, I've come to understand why they did what they did. They were grieving, just as I was, and in their own way, they thought they were protecting me. We made a terrible mistake, my mom said recently, tears brimming in her eyes. But we're so proud of how you've handled all of this. I don't know if we deserve your forgiveness, but we're grateful for it. Those words stayed with me. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving them of their choices. It was about finding peace for myself and learning to let go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. Emma's story taught me more than I ever could have imagined. It showed me that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, as long as you're willing to put in the effort. It taught me that people aren't defined by their worst moments and that redemption is always possible. But above all, it taught me the power of truth. My parents' lie may have been rooted in love, but it caused more pain than they ever intended. The truth, no matter how painful or uncomfortable, is always better than a comforting lie. Looking back, I realized that those years of grief and confusion shaped me into the person I am today. They taught me resilience, compassion, and the importance of honesty. And while I wish things had been different, I'm grateful for the lessons they brought. Today, my family is in a better place. We're not perfect, far from it, but we've learned how to be open with one another in a way we never were before. We talk about Emma openly now, celebrating her progress and supporting her as she rebuilds her life. As for Emma, she's not just my sister anymore, she's my hero. Her journey from rock bottom to where she is now is a testament to her strength and determination. Watching her rise above her past gives me hope, not just for her, but for all of us. Life is messy and unpredictable, but if this experience has taught me anything, it's that even in the darkest moments, there's always a path forward. And while the scars of the past will always be there, they don't have to define us. Emma's story isn't just one of mistakes and regrets, it's a story of growth, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And as we move forward together, I know we'll face whatever comes next with honesty, strength, and love.